Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 17th paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The title being First Speciality, Moral Forces and Their Effects, in brackets hostile feeling. The text follows. The first of these specialties consists in the moral forces and effects. The combat is, in its origin, the expression of hostile feeling. But in our great combats, which we call wars, the hostile feeling frequently resolves itself into merely a hostile view. And there is usually no innate hostile feeling residing in individual against individual. Nevertheless, the combat never passes off without such feelings being brought into activity. National hatred, which is seldom wanting in our wars, is a substitute for personal hostility in the breast of individual opposed to individual. But where this also is wanting, and at first no animosity of feeling subsists, a hostile feeling is kindled by the combat itself. For an act of violence which anyone commits upon us by order of his superior will excite in us a desire to retaliate and be revenged on him, sooner than on the superior power at whose command the act was done. This is human or animal, if we will. Still, it is so. We are very apt to regard the combat in theory as an abstract trial of strength without any participation on the part of the feelings, and that is one of the thousand errors which theorists deliberately commit because they do not see its consequences. Besides that excitation of feelings naturally arising from the combat itself, there are others also which do not essentially belong to it, but which, on account of their relationship, easily unite with it: ambition, love of power, enthusiasm of every kind, etc., etc. So, this is a paragraph in which von Clausewitz starts to describe the factors that rendered, the principal factors actually, that rendered difficult the making of a theory of the conduct of war, or the theory of the art of war, which is actually the same thing in practice, by his own definition. So it's the first paragraph of a long list that we talked about last time, when he introduced these topics, and it has to do once again with the importance of moral forces and their effects, right? And more importantly, of the hostile feeling in itself, right? This is the first factor that is also in fact the most important of all, as we have seen in the previous paragraphs, when we see that fundamentally that the war is fundamentally a clash between moral forces, right? And moral forces are the element that is somewhat more easily overlooked at all times when trying to, in fact, building up the theory of the conduct of war, but also as a consequence, also analyzing military history and its, and how it works. And this is very important because von Clausewitz will get to explaining the importance of military history also for the construction of the theory of the art of war, and here by listing the difficulties of assessing what these hostile feelings are and quantifying them, measuring them in some way, to have a kind of scientific approach that is practically impossible when it comes to the conduct of war. He is posing us in front of the most immediate evidence that hostile feelings cannot be measured, right? They can be measured, let's say, through intuition, through experience in a certain way, but this measurement remains always kind of imprecise. It eludes our understanding most of the times, right? But assessing it, it's of fundamental importance for defining the theory of the art of war in itself, right? Because it's literally the single most important thing And in this paragraph, von Clausewitz explains it quite quite clearly. So here he talks about his first specialties. At least is translated in this version. The first of these specialties consists in the moral forces and their effects, right? So not just in the moral forces as such, but naturally their interaction. Think about the reciprocal relations that we have studied in the first book, and that's exactly what happens here. It's not a matter of just having moral forces on your own. It's also employing these moral forces against someone who is employing his own moral forces against you as well. And von Clausewitz writes, the combat is, in its origin, the expression of hostile feeling. So, as a definition, this is crystalline clear, right? Everything starts from an intention, right? That is, in this sense, not even rational in itself. Always remember that there are that there is this kind of primitive, beast-like. In fact, von Clausewitz, if you heard it now, while I was reading, talks about this. There is this kind of even animal side of us that is objectively the one that prevails at all times. We think to be kind of rational beings, but it's absolutely evident that we're not rational at all, right? Rationality is just like a tool that we developed, evolutionarily speaking, and that we kind of cultivate in our societies in order to be an instrument for what pushes us, right? That we can't, most of the times we can't control. Of course, there are certain basic needs that we have to survive, but there are also these many other, in fact, feelings that we have for several other reasons that are very complicated to even read and to know, but by our own selves. We just know that we feel them, right? But it's a very difficult enterprise just to try to understand them as a whole. So, von Clausewitz reminds us that the combat in itself, so not just war as such, but the combat meant as the most primordial and ancestral fight in this duel that basically war is, just on a larger scale, has its origin in the expression of hostile feeling. Like, it all starts like that. It's like, and this is very interesting, and I always like to remember how von Clausewitz opens it by defining war as a duel on a large scale, because it's as if it comes very easy to interpret wars in this fashion. Like, just imagine you have animosity towards someone for some reason, right? This will rarely, in kind of civilized society, escalate into like a real duel, like into a fight. But just think about seeing it on a larger scale, right? As if you were a state, basically, of hundreds or tens of millions of people, right, with their own military and so on. So this hostile feeling can result, in that case, on, I don't know, hundreds of deaths for some reason, but covert ops with some other, military operations, even through certain indirect effects, like with an economical policy. Always remember that here war is just an option, it's just a card that you can use, that is in the hands of politics, right? Always remember this, that war is nothing without politics, right? There is never a moment in which war is detached from politics. War is always a tool of politics, and at every single moment of any war, it's politics that dictates what happens, right? And obviously there are other factors intervening, but the military operation is basically a political act of violence, right? So it all starts with the feeling, right? Just like in politics. Politics has basically this more decisional nature, for which the kind of catalyzes the feelings of the people that now von Clausewitz will talk about, right? Politics has been defined by von Clausewitz like the singular most rational element in the field of, in the Clausewitzian trinity, right? Politics is meant to be reason. The military is basically a bunch of gamblers who just enjoy this free activity of the soul, this game proper. The people is the irrational element. The people is if you want, the primordial force. The one, however, that is particularly important because without his support, you basically can't fight. You basically can't have a war. You can't make the political intention follow, right? Evolve into a military operation. If you don't have popular support, you can't have a war, right? So always bear this in mind. This is particularly important because it washes away all the idiotic statements like those soldiers were obliged by the state to go to war. No, it's never like that. It's a whole people that decides whether you go at war or not. This doesn't even happen into totalitarianisms, into dictatorships. Without the popular support, you can't fight, right? This is the point. This is what von Clausewitz teaches us, and objectively, it is so, right? But the people is fundamentally stupid, right? It's irrational. It's the most irrational of all of these elements, right? Naturally, there are peoples that are better than others, that are kind of more intelligent than others, and in this sense more civic than others, because intelligence in this sense is discovering the relation that exists, in fact, in the Clausewitzian trinity between politics, the war, and society. But still, it's a very difficultly controllable force in itself. And von Clausewitz makes the statement, let's repeat, combat is in its origin the expression of hostile feeling, yes, but in our great combats, which we call wars, the hostile feeling frequently resolves itself into merely hostile view, and there is usually no innate hostile feeling residing in individual against individual. Now, this is a very important statement. What does it mean? Let's explain it. It's basically two parts, right? So, there are hostile feelings. Humans are made of these hostile feelings largely, and this help us to give us the boost to like wake up in the morning, to go to work, to study, to achieve our goals, and a healthy dose of aggressiveness is vital for civilization. Remember that without violence there can't be civilization. This is what even all religions basically teach us metaphorically. And it's evident, supported by every scientific evidence we have collected at this point. So the problem, though, is that bringing this hostile feeling at a higher level, right, that means to organize it for the aim of a war, right? That for political reasons we decide to fight. Things start a bit to vary, right? Because who decides wars, right? Is whether we fight or not, and how we do it, is politics, right? It's politics that decides whether war starts or not. It's not really the hostile feeling. It's not this primitive / irrational side of society that makes it done. It's always politics, because in order to fight a war, you need intelligence, you need rationality, you need to organize your forces, you need but even before than that, you have to understand what's going on around, right? Which is what the individual person doesn't know. And that's why politics and the military have such developed organizations, because they're aimed principally not even at fighting, but at finding and enacting, let's say, this violent solution, but in first of all sorting out what the best option is, right? And this is all the big deal of the story, because it's this the violent element is always like an option of politics, but it has to be enacted by a decision. So at that point, it's a political decision, as always, because war is exclusively a political act of violence. Always remember, this is the definition of war. And naturally, it requires a political decision, but also this support from the people that is required to have this hostile feeling that is necessary to fight war, right? What von Clausewitz is saying here in the first part, that the hostile feeling frequently resolves itself into merely a hostile view, means that this resolution mostly comes from the rationalization that policy makes, right? Politics decides whether to fight or not. And in this intention, we don't see much of a hostile feeling by itself. There is just a hostile design, meaning that, our objective is to make war. But at that point, politics that has to enact war is mostly concerned in fundamentally trying to foresee how this has to happen, which is let's say the most rational and scientific take on what that could be, right? Is largely devoid of hostile feeling in itself. Always remember this, that the higher you go up into the military hierarchy, and the least hostile feeling actually comes to influence your decision, right? And the same goes, like, this is true for the military in the hierarchy, in the sense that obviously the more you have to take, the more you rise up through the ranks, and the more you have to be intelligent and not let's say emotional, right? The soldier in the first line has to be someone who feels the rage and courage and has to tear people apart. The general is the one who literally, the commander-in-chief is the one who literally gets the military mandate. The political mandate of this military operation, right? So he has to be a politician a bit himself, right? Von Clausewitz has talked about this, that you don't win a war fundamentally just through like strategy and tactics. You win wars chiefly politically, right? What happens, of course, on the field has an impact on politics in itself, on society and whatever. But the general, this is what von Clausewitz says, that thinks that he's kind of free from politics when he acts is basically just a fool, right? Because politics constantly dictates the military action at every single instant, right? Obviously, there can be, let's say, a greater or lesser degree of military autonomy. But at that point, it can happen that that by unhinging the military, the military operation, let's say, from the political mandate, means simply that the military operation will shipwreck, because it basically gets out of touch with what the political thing is, and therefore cannot accomplish anything that politics has rightfully seen as what has to be done, right? Because you don't make a military operation as playing a football match. The military operation, this is probably the most difficult thing to understand in absolute terms, and it's of crucial importance also for civical reasons, for political reasons. Wars are not fought like something that is undetached from from reality, from politics and society. It's not let's meet and let's play just for the sake of it, because war is simply a political act. It's decided for political reasons, and it doesn't have any other aim than the political one at the end of the picture, right? The military basically just say how you can achieve that through violence, and how you have to exercise violence materially, but it doesn't have in itself the force to let's say, it doesn't have in itself the let's say the dimension of what needs to be done, right? The military can take over, but at that point that becomes a political act in itself. So if you hear this video for the first time, if you've never heard these things, you probably think I'm nuts or whatever. This is literally what happens, and what has always happened, continues to happen, and will always happen in the history of humanity. There's not a single moment in which war is not guided by politics, right? You can start doing things on the field that have nothing to do with what the political mandate has given you, and that will ruin everything, right? But most of the time, actually, it's the other way around, meaning that it's politics that, making a wrong decision, uses the military as the instrument that it is to do things that are wrong, right? And that's why politics, the war is mostly a political matter, because wars are won chiefly politically, right? There needs to be a commitment, there needs to be a choice, there needs to be an aim that goes beyond what is fought on the field, that has to do with the enemy in his entirety, and in fact in his moral resources that are the most important thing. So maybe we have digressed a little bit, but what von Clausewitz is saying here is that politics rationalizes the hostile feeling. There's just a hostile design and hostile intention to fight, but it's not the political business to fight the story, to have within itself the moral resources that are needed, right? That is something that in turn starts pertaining to society as a whole, to the people as a whole, to which also of which the same military, the same politicians are part, right? But the two things are distinguished within the same people, right? And what von Clausewitz says in the second part is that there is usually no innate hostile feeling residing in individual against individual, right? Which means that when you decide to fight a war, right, there can be fundamentally a lot of reasons for and a lot of animosity and hostile feelings already between, as we will see now, a nation or another, right? But the individual soldiers fundamentally do not care. It's not that if you send two people for political reasons to fight against each other, that they individually have something against each other normally, right? They do have at one point, but that is, from zero to infinite, let's say, for what is humanly possible, of course. But that's not what the deal is. It's not that politics sends to fight people who inherently hate each other, hate the enemy as such, and care about that. But no problem, right? Do not let this statement now let you think that that doesn't matter. You can turn anyone into a killer in less than 3 seconds, right? There are many ways of doing it, and in fact, von Clausewitz says in here, nevertheless, the combat never passes off without such feelings being brought into activity, right? What does it mean? Well, it means that once you start fighting, such feelings are immediately brought into activity. It is natural. He says fundamentally this. Once again, it's 2 phrases, but let's go in order. The first one, national hatred, which is seldom wanting in our words, here he's referring basically about Europe at the time, is a substitute for personal hostility in the breast of individual opposed to individual, right? So von Clausewitz says something that is sadly true, is that normally it's not that difficult to find a group of people hating another group of people, right? It's normal. It's how we are built up, genetically speaking. That's how we are structured and how we behave normally. We need to feel part of a group. We need to feel secure with that group, and part of this need reflects itself into the hatred and margination towards someone else. This is ineliminable from human nature. There is no way it can't be corrected in any ways. Means to trying to correct it paradoxically bring to the increase of hatred. This is what also is happening currently at this point, because we are trying to deny our biological structure. And that's probably one of the single most dangerous thing that you can do at the level of, literally, there is no difference between that and political eugenetics, right? It's the same. It brings to the same effects, right, of making hatred escalate in an immense, by an immense degree, and yet it was many politicians keep doing it, which also proclaims their complete illiteracy in terms of biological and scientific evidence by any academic standard. And Von Clausewitz says that there is, therefore, that this hatred that is somewhat innate is always present, unfortunately, that can, let's say, fill this gap, of, let's say, of the lack of an individual, a personal hostility of individual opposed to individual, which means that it's very easy to turn a people against another, in other ways to fuel this hatred at the point of employing it as a social hostile feeling to support the political act of war, and making follow also into combat, right? Hating someone. I mean, this is extremely easy, right? You can see it everywhere around in social and social network. It's not that we live in a particularly, at least social networks gives us the impression that we live in a particularly hating society, right? That hatred is everywhere. Social networks are a bit of a trick on their own for the dynamics in which they work, but at the end of the day, you can see sometimes through them how primitive-minded, actually, even in the West, we are, right? In regarding to looking at other countries, at other nations. Fundamentally, we stick to prejudices, to stereotypes. We don't understand anything about history, about politics, about society, about economics, about culture, about religion, about ethnicity, about biology, about philosophy, about languages. We don't understand anything, basically, but all we understand is that you can insult someone just because he belongs to a certain group. Because, hey, that's easy. And that's objectively easy. It's not just a bad habit. It's literally how we are programmed, genetically speaking. That's why it counts so easily. It's not a matter of education, right? Education helps up to a certain point, but hostility cannot be eliminated, unfortunately, from our genes, right? We do function like this, and a person who doesn't function like this either has something seriously wrong going on at a clinical level, or either it's not a human being, right? In the day in which these things will be trying to be eradicated from us, we will probably live in a very dark time, and this has nothing to do with justifying hatred. This has to do with, on the contrary, in recognizing that this exists and that it doesn't matter what people think about it. This is not a matter of opinion. It simply exists and you have to deal with it. And if you don't deal with it, you're just going to make it worse. Because ignorance always makes it worse, and denial especially makes it worse. Very worse, right? And this is also a big lesson we have to learn in general, because as long as we know that we have this hating potential, we can disciplinate it, we can regulate it, we can kind of stem it, we can counter that with some measure, with some other energies, we can't erase it, we can't erase violence, we can't erase hatred, we can't erase aggressiveness. As we said before, we do need, paradoxically, a healthy dose of all these things. Like we need a healthy dose of many other things, including tolerance and comprehension, intelligence, etc. But it's a balance. If you think that humans can go without hatred, you're basically speaking an anti-human opinion, right? And that's pretty serious. I mean, study clinical psychology. This is not a matter of opinion, right? And secondly, what von Clausewitz says is that, but where this also, so this national hatred, right, is wanting, and at first no animosity of feeling subsists, a hostile feeling is kindled by the combat itself, right? So von Clausewitz is saying to us, maybe two people really do not have any special hatred towards each other, but once combat starts, this hatred starts, right? It develops, it develops and it grows. Why? Because, quote, he says, for an act of violence which anyone commits upon us by order of his superior will excite in us a desire to retaliate and be revenged on him sooner than on the superior power at whose command the act was done. This is also another terrific quote. He explains why combat excites hatred and makes it spark, because fundamentally humans do not even care the higher reasons for which people act and cause harm. They tendentially, instinctively hate those people who enact that violence, right? In other words, instead of blaming politics, that is the one that causes the this violence to flare, basically it's much easier to start hating the person who enacts it. Now this is not a moralistic statement. It's really von Clausewitz explaining how we behave instinctively, right? We don't feel immediate hatred towards someone who has sent soldiers to invade our home. We immediately feel hatred for those soldiers themselves, right? For many reasons, because maybe we see them directly, we see committing violence, we see them as the immediate enemy, the one you have to fight against, because the politician who sent them is at home while these guys are there, right? So it's instinctive to feel hatred for whoever commits violence towards you, right? And this happens simply because at a evolutionary biological level, we developed our behavior, our current behavior, in a time in which, of course, this superior political mandate didn't quite exist as such. I mean, we were living in bands of hunters-gatherers, and at that point, who you saw, even if it was a group of, hundreds of people, was essentially easily identifiable. There was no higher power, right? There weren't more developed societies, so it was easy to hate directly that, and that's how that group of people, and that's how we, those visible ones, right? And that's how we developed, right? Then eventually civilization speeded up much faster than our nervous system could adapt to, and therefore even in wars today, where obviously people fight because there is a much higher direction for this, we don't feel as much hate towards the head of state who sent soldiers to fight in a place, but the soldiers themselves, right? So this is just experiment, just watch a documentary about all the wars that are going on, whichever side you want to pick, and see what are your immediate feelings towards this whole story, right? This is naturally not meaning that we are too stupid or too animal-like to understand that, of course, responsibility falls upon the greater responsibility at least falls upon someone else than just the people committing the violence, delivering the violence, but it's still what we feel instinctively, right? And then this has nothing to do also with the moral responsibility, because of course every person who commits violence is responsible for it, right, in a way or another. As I was saying before, never think that you can start a war without the support of the majority of the people, or that the soldier who is using the gun is somewhat not responsible for the life that it takes. This doesn't tell us anything about, of course, the reasons why that happens. Sometimes it's, this is, based on your moral sensitivity, your moral criteria. But obviously, there are moments in which you feel justified to kill someone. Like if you're in a war, I don't know, you're thinking about liberating a country from a dictatorship. You can say it's fair to kill a person, like a soldier that is shooting at you, right? And this is also our rules of engagement in internationally, as like the NATO, or whatever, even the United Nations. Like you should, you never shoot first. You always shoot when you are shot at. So there's that's a bit of gallantry involved, a bit like of a ritual convention. But the point is, of course, it's terrible to kill someone, and definitely who kills someone feels what it means to bear that responsibility of taking away someone's life. But at the same time, we do give different justifications for it, right? If you're fighting for whatever reasons yours is, and you deem it more important than the life of the person you're taking away, it's entirely your choice. And of course, this doesn't mean to be morally relativistic, because I don't think it is. So there is a truth, right? There is a right and there is a wrong. The problem most of the times is trying to exactly sorting that out and trying to understand it. But of course, there's a big difference between killing an innocent civilian and shooting, I don't know, a terrorist that is threatening to make other people die. You do feel a very different moral commitment in there, and that's what also historians are called to respond of, because naturally we have to describe fundamentally what happens. It is important to attribute correctly the responsibility of certain actions, and that's what fundamentally moral, what fighting moral relativism is, right? Moral relativism is simply saying, every kill is the same thing. No, it is not. It is not, right? Because there are different consequences to that and different causes for that. So, as harsh as it sounds, it isn't the case. Now it's not important to descend into kind of this moral philosophical problems, but let's say that it's still important to recognize that humans have certain instincts that lead them in different directions to the ones that reason would lead them to. So it's always important to bear it to mind, and always know, and this is what von Clausewitz also teaches us, is that in war there's not much room for cold thinking, right? War, especially on the ground where people actually kill each other, well, that's the moment in which you're put under the greatest stress imaginable, and therefore things become much more difficult, right? And we all know, unfortunately, that there are also many mistakes, right? I don't know, think about friendly fire, or in fact misidentification that leads to killing innocents, or stuff like that. It happens a lot, right? And that already tells you by sheer size what's the inherent responsibility also of the political mandate to start something like that. So you start here feeling like the sheer quantities that are involved into the Clausewitzian Trinity in terms of moral weight, of moral responsibility. This is particularly important because you can't be a military historian worth of this name if you first of all don't understand the impact of death, right? You can't study, and that's why von Clausewitz is also insisting rightfully so much on hostile feeling and stating that war is essentially not a clash between that gun or that other or those numbers of that other, but essentially between moral forces, because this is literally what it is. The feeling that it can give you, the risk of being threatened, your life being endangered, of knowing that, I don't know, your family has been massacred, or whatever reason it is. It's really the largest makes really the largest part of the commitment in the whole thing. So it's really important to concentrate on these factors, because if you think that war is just about knowing the performances of a tank or a plane, you just be an engineer. Don't be a historian, because that basically has virtually nothing to do with what things will turn out like. And I know that this is kind of harsh to say, because people will say, well, but it's important even to know what makes the difference in combat. Yes, but that's still not what leads the thing, right? Those machines are animated by people, were in fact moved by these hostile feelings, and you can't ignore them. You can't ignore morale. You can't think that war is a clash between robots that just kill each other heartlessly, that do not have courage or cowardice, into which a moral ethics is kind of secondary, or you take it out of the equation because it's too difficult to calculate, because that's exactly what brings to military disasters, because basically it takes away the single most important and decisive factor in war: feelings. That's what it is. And always remember that moral forces in this sense have to do also with intelligence, right? Also, intelligence is a moral force, because it has naturally to work also in, let's say, it has to be expressed with capacities that are not physical. For example, war is regularly won by the most intelligent, not by the strongest, right? So this could open a series of infinite digressions, but I think that if you followed the series since the beginning, you perfectly know what we are referring to here. In any case, the way von Clausewitz put it is beautiful, right? Because here there is the sense of revenge, right? The even if here says that humans are excited in a desire to retaliate and to be a revenge on someone, rather than the person who sent him to do that, right? This could open like to another digression, like even like the at a strategic level, you ways that you're gonna hit. Think about terrorism. Terrorism is it's somewhat an inferior form of fight, in the sense that you can theoretically win someone through terrorism. It happens. You can make immense damages through that. But the point is that it goes very far from getting it done with, because terrorism normally destroys like people who have nothing to do with the main direction, right? And we deem it as vile conventionally because it kills in fact innocents, right? that is also a mean of war. That is also, the definition of terrorism is extremely broad. You don't have to especially I think at the beginning of the 21st century, we have created a picture of the terrorist that is very limited to a certain type of terrorism, but terrorism also has a kind of a very loose definition. You can even make a strategic bombardment with terroristic aims, right? But maybe we'll talk about this at a different level, which has nothing to do with moral accusation. It has nothing to do with that. Here we are merely interested at the effect that has, hopefully to win a war, right? Because this is what von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege is about. This is a manual conceived to tell you, look, if you it's extremely messed up to pretend to know how to win a war, but at least if you know these things, chances are that at least you are prepared to engage into one, right? Instead of simply dreaming of what an ideal war should be about. In von Clausewitz's comments on this last statement about the immediate feelings that we feel and towards Vom, by saying this is human or beast-like, if we will, still it is so. Now this is one of the most powerful phrases in absolute terms, because it tells you that all of these moral problems, like why this happens, no, maybe we aren't, we're more civilized, basically do not matter. Like, this is literally what happens, and this happens contrarily wise to common beliefs towards war, not because it's inhuman, but because this is probably the single most human thing that exists. Right? It's partly animal, as von Clausewitz says in here, but if there is something that is really the most human thing in absolute terms, well, this is war. And it is an asinine mistake to pretend that war is somehow an expression of barbarity by itself. War, by norm, is one of the greatest expressions of civilization that exist. Not because its aims cannot be wicked or it is just to do so. Here we're not concerned about moral problems. Here we're concerned about how it works. To make war and to win it, it takes a freaking civilization, which means science, advancement, rationality, intelligence, know-how, all products that a society of barbarians normally do not have, and barbarians are defeated in front of civilization. This is the one of the most important things to remember in absolute terms, that denying, or better saying, attaching this stigma to war as something inhuman is probably the best way to cause further mistakes when it comes to enact violence, right? Because it's fundamentally a dogmatic and ideological and extremistic approach, right? It's like pacifism. You would think that pacifism is fundamentally as a consequence has fundamentally more peace, right? It's the complete opposite. Pacifism in itself is an extremist ideology that basically denies the rightfulness of violence in itself, right? Which means, the Americans should have not landed in Europe in 1944 because, we shouldn't make war in the first place, right? So resistance in Europe to Nazi fascism or to communism is not important, right? Because we shouldn't use war. So these people are dangerous because when it comes to reality, of course, humans, first of all, will behave in a different way, them included. Secondly, it's just a declaration of complete ignorance about humanity, about history, about politics, about society, about war. Every attitude that fundamentally exalts an absolute dogma as a general tendency to follow without scoping what reality works like, or at least what we can understand from it, is inherently a recipe for disaster, because it's basically denying that politics has war as an option in itself. It's basically denying that violence and aggressiveness belong to humanity as such, right? If there is something that that history has taught us, is that progress, is that civilization hasn't absolutely in any way decreased our destructive capabilities, our wealth, our quality of life, our education, let's say our capacities have dramatically escalated in parallel with our destructive capabilities, right? There's never been a setback in that sense. Today we are the most destructive thing that ever existed on this earth, and yet we are living in the best way we ever lived on this earth. So this is paradoxical. And apparently, if you have been taught by this culturalist approaches that basically war is fought just by barbarians, a person who declares that has basically no credibility of any type, simply because the entire set of knowledge that we dispose of states the complete opposite of that statement. And I wouldn't like to sound so peremptory, right? But I wouldn't do it if this didn't actually cause more harm to people. And this is why I urge you to study von Clausewitz if you've never done it, because it's a mind opener, it's an eye opener. It tells you really how it is, and then it leaves you with responsibility of dealing with that, which is exclusively your own responsibility. If you blame someone else because something happens, you're basically just trying to ideologically idealize yourself and to make you sound special and brave. No, our duty as humans is to interact socially in a way that we can always make the best choice. And it's very easy to demonize our adversaries and to simply believe that we are so pure and righteous and good and intelligent. And that's exactly the best way to give up the effort for further understanding and trying to solve problems that really matter for people that die every day around the world, right? So if you're really concerned with moral issues, you should accept what von Clausewitz says, because it's literally what it is. And other idealistic approaches on this takes on this theme are basically just a deviation from this. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, again, we are very apt to regard the combat in theory as an abstract trial of strength, without any participation on the part of the feelings. And that is one of the 1,000 errors which theorists deliberately commit because they do not see its consequences. But this is also very important, and it has partly to do with what we have just said. Of course, we have already explained these things on other occasions, but here it's worth repeating it because von Clausewitz explains us the moral connection that exists between the two things. So essentially, the instinctive way to consider war is to regard the combat in theory as an abstract trial of strength. That is to say, I don't know, I have this volume of muscles in my body and therefore I will crush you if you have less. Which is a mistake, because it's not about how many muscles you are, but how intelligent fundamentally you are. It's sticking to this material dimension of, let's say, quantifiable physical strength at every level, from number of bombs or bullets or what you have on paper, without considering what is that actually moves this strength. without any participation on the part of the feelings, von Clausewitz writes. And this is basically the single most important mistake that theorists deliberately commit. It's important to stress here the deliberate action, because as we've seen in the paragraphs about the development, let's say in the attempts of tracing the theory of the art of war, if you remember, the very first step was actually acknowledging that moral resources are important, because the thing is much more complicated than it seems. But the reaction was to say, okay, well, those are too difficult to enumerate or to frame into a theory, so let's start from other stuff that we can measure, such as the material dimension of the story, and hoping that that can serve for something, which didn't, and that's probably one of the greatest mistakes in absolute terms, right? It's really about the deepest miscomprehension of what war is in reality, right? Because every person is capable of abstracting, saying, that army, I don't know, had that number of soldiers, were equipped in that way, that fought with those tactics, that I don't know, that ate that certain amount. But nobody considers, because there is no way to quantify it scientifically, the moral, right? Even I read my share of military history books, and objectively it's very rare, also given that I've been writing my own share of stuff about military history, that it's extremely difficult to find in the first place anyone who can assess moral quantities. I mean, what the hell do we know historically most of the times? It's a real problem. But paradoxically, it's also the most overlooked, because there is apparently no solution, right? Just right now, I'm making a very let's say, well, let's not enter into details, but here I'm very concerned about certain material objects of war, but it's exactly their well, here it gets complicated to explain, because it's basically listing a lot of armies that fought in a particular scenario over a certain amount of years, and we don't have actually informations about their own moral strength, or at least we do have, but we have to read through the lines, and obviously there are no quantifiers of moral feelings, right? Of moral resources. So what do? We have to look at other aspects, right? We have to look at the outcome of war as well, and try to guess at one point whether this, which is what any historian is brought to do at a certain point, but shouldn't do, especially when trying to find a causal relation between, let's say, cause-effect relation between two events. But that it makes you understand that such things like moral resources do exist, and very often they are the ones that decide the whole thing, right? It's also this one should be a bit corrected. With von Clausewitz we will get into it more thoroughly, because he's very serious about this. In any case, never underestimate feelings, never underestimate hostile feeling proper. I mean, literally the will that you have to break the head of the person you have in front of you while you're fighting. Because that's the single most important thing that exists. And the fanatics of technique, of details, of technology, very often do not get this. Because they have to state that everything is about, that inch that blade is able to reach, right? And not understanding that that's literally the least important thing when it comes to two people fighting. The most important thing is moral resources. And the interesting thing here is that von Clausewitz says that these theorists deliberately commit the mistake of abstracting this material strengths, because practically they do not see the consequences of such mistake. Which means what exactly? This is very interesting, because especially said by a person like von Clausewitz that fought throughout all the wars of coalition during Napoleonic era, because he saw the consequences of such mistakes. When you see a person dying, especially as a consequence of your own mistake, von Clausewitz was an officer, and officers send people to die in a way or another, and many times there is not even a way to tell whether it was the best option or worst option, right? This is also a problem that von Clausewitz will deal with at one point, like saying, how do we reconstruct a clash? I mean, many people presume that, we know about history because, it's written in books, it's data, it's fairly easy, you know what a battle was like. Basically, nobody knows. What is the decisive battle? You think that there is a way to tell that? You think that we are able to compute every single factor that is going on there and knowing how that works? We can come up with theories, with studies, but that's not reality, right? We can't get there. We can't get to the truth. We can't come closer to the truth if we are good historians, but we'll never know what exactly would actually happen. Nobody does, not even when things are taking place. You think that people who participate in battles actually know what those battles went like? Just read a source of eyewitnesses of battles and then tell me whether you can answer affirmatively to that question. And if you don't deal with military history, and that's what von Clausewitz will lead us to, you can't understand that. And even more, of course, if you don't deal with actual war, with real war, you can't even properly feel, however, the importance of these hostile feelings. And that's why, and these moral resources, because von Clausewitz says that theorists, in this sense, abstracted from reality. And when reality instead confronts you with this harsh truth, you start thinking about that. Because there are certain things that you see in war that you can never forget. Which is the danger of ideologies, because ideologies abstract. That's why I was kind of ranting against pacifism before, because everything that ends up in ism is an ism, in fact. It's an overstressing, it's almost a dogmatic, fideistic approach to a certain attitude, right? That is no good, because it pretends to be applicable for everything, and instead it's not. It's a tendency that, doesn't find any evidence into reality when you applicate that. Because if we did, we would have solved every problem that exists in here, right? So beware of ideologists. Stay open. Never stop to one think, never stop to one belief, never stop to one, be always, have your own opinion, build your own convictions, but be always open to challenge them. Especially when you're more deeply convinced about them, because that's literally what it's even from the dynamic from which best can come, right? The more you believe in something, and the better service it makes for you to understand that is wrong at one point, because it tells you much more than just knowing, being wrong about one detail, right? And that helps you to develop a lot. And von Clausewitz concludes by saying, besides that excitation of feelings naturally arising from the combat itself, there are others also which do not essentially belong to it, but which on account of their relationship, easily unite with it. Ambition, love of power, enthusiasm of every kind, etc., etc. Yes, so this kind of brings us back to let's say the impossibility of assessing the moral forces and their effects, in the sense that in all of this, right, aside from hostile feelings, there's a lot of other stuff. There is ambition, there's love for power, enthusiasm of every kind, right? It can be everything. You know, that there are so many reasons for which you fight a war. Like, every person has a reason, a different reason. You will never find a person who has fundamentally the same reason as others. There's no person who is moved by the same feelings. There's just nothing like a person who believes exactly the same thing that another person believes. There's never been. There will never be. Thank God. I mean, that's beautiful as well, because otherwise we would lose the ability to develop ourselves in that way. And that's where responsibility also kicks in more importantly, because we all have to reconcile fundamentally our own subjective experience to reality. And that's the challenge. It's as if we were exposed to this constant attrition between the two things. And obviously reality invariably wins, because we're not stronger than reality. Nobody is. But we still are part of reality. And we can do something about that. We can behave in a way that things can change within reality, within the realm of reality. There is a lot we could tell in relation to this, of course, and we can naturally we stop here because von Clausewitz finished the paragraph. Next time we'll talk about the impressions of danger and courage, right? But this paragraph was very important, like very important, because it shows an aspect of the story that is dramatically overlooked. And believe me, I'm not paid by anyone. I'm not doing this because I have this personal conviction of mine. I usually don't care about what other people say. But von Clausewitz is the only single thing I ever read that deeply gave me like security about the reliability of what is written here. It's not an overestimation. It's not a fideistic approach towards what is written here. It's that thinking about it, it makes more than sense, right? It's important to understand more deeply what this means in practice than actually having sympathy or antipathy towards it. And it does, because it has an effect. Of course, as anything human is, you can't deem it as approximate, but really I've never read anything less approximate than this, ever. And it's not that I've read just a few things in my life. So I can, I can't guarantee you that, you don't have to believe me, of course, but just try. Just take a look at it. Just pick up the book and start studying it, not reading it. And especially never think that you're more intelligent than this person. Never, because you're not. We are not, right? He's the genius here, and you have to look at him exclusively in that way, because if you do less than that, basically you have not understood what he's doing, right? And it's subtle, because people are not instinctively eager to tribute that, like to say, oh, you were right? This thing is is better than I am, right? Instinctively, we don't work like that. But there is a point in which you understand something, and you're willing to change your mind at one point. And I just say this, and the rest is relatively. It's up to you, right? Like everything. This is probably what von Clausewitz says. Most importantly, you can't refuse your own responsibility, because that at one point will crush you. Otherwise, you can't think to be isolating here. You can't think that such certain things do not happen. You can't simply ignore certain problems, or to minimize them, or to interpret them simplistically, or like, well, whatever. I usually talk too much, and you criticize me for that, so I will I will stop it here for now. And I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.